When we hear the words pilgrim and pilgrimage, it's likely that we immediately think of the ancient tradition of embarking on long and perilous journeys in search of miracles, healing, or some tangible confirmation of religious beliefs. In medieval times, pilgrimage was a common part of Christian practice. It's been continuous since not long after the death of Jesus Christ, right up to today. And the destination was very often one of the great cathedrals that by the 12th and 13th centuries were all over Western Europe and across Great Britain, established as the unmissable focal points of Christian communities and worship. Through the ages, cathedrals and pilgrimage have had a very close relationship, and it's a tradition that's enjoying a remarkable revival today, as people again feel compelled to take to the road in search of spiritual solace or reassurance. A pilgrimage can still, today, be a life-changing experience.
Hello, I'm David Suchet, and this beautifully preserved street is known as the Vicar's Close here at Wells Cathedral. The Close is the oldest residential street in Europe and has been home to the Vicar's Choral at Wells since the middle of the 14th century. It's a reminder that Britain's great cathedrals are at the very heart of the local community. Over the centuries, many thousands of pilgrims and visitors have been welcomed by cathedrals such as Wells, often on long and perilous journeys in search of miracles, healing, or some tangible confirmation of their religious beliefs. Welcome to the Pilgrim's Way to Britain's great cathedrals. In these programs, we're visiting many of the great cathedrals of England and Wales, exploring their long links to pilgrimage and how the highs and lows of history have shaped what we can see today.
I'm going to delve into the fascinating history of these remarkable buildings and the even more remarkable stories of the saints and bishops who were in many cases the original inspiration for both the journey and the destination. Along the way, I'll also be exploring some of the ancient pilgrim routes, and also a few of the newer ones which have been created specifically to cater for the increasing number of modern-day travellers. Many of these people begin their journeys simply as curious tourists, but their experiences along the way have proved compelling enough to make them pilgrims by their journey's end. We're starting our journey at London's Southwark Cathedral. Situated on the south bank of the River Thames, this is where, over the centuries, a great many pilgrims have also started their spiritual journeys. And we'll finish this programme at Glastonbury, a place of both myths and spirituality. But before then, we'll be visiting some of the most important cathedrals in England as we journey across the south of this country, from east to west. Southwark Cathedral is very much a quiet oasis in the middle of a bustling and noisy city. It's a place where you can escape from everyday life for a little while and pause to reflect on the past or contemplate the future. perhaps in either meditation or prayer. There's something very reassuring about being in an inspiring building that has over many centuries provided solace, reassurance, and hope to those who have entered through its doors. Southwark only achieved cathedral status in 1905, and it's often been in the shadow of London's two better-known big churches, Westminster Abbey and St Paul's Cathedral. But it's an equally impressive building that today is very much part of a thriving inner-city community. It's close to London's entertainment district. The original Globe Theatre was not far away and has long been associated with the acting profession, as the monument to Shakespeare in the South Isle attests. It's also from very near here that Geoffrey Chaucer's famous group of 14th century pilgrims set out from the original Tabard Inn, heading for Canterbury. This departure is depicted in one of Southwark's stained glass windows. At the time of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the Norman-era monastery at Southwark was already falling into decline, and the increasing lawlessness of the neighbourhood saw the monks confined to quarters after dark. Total demolition was narrowly averted, and through the 19th century, an extensive restoration program has resulted in the magnificent Gothic-style church we see today. The big attraction at Canterbury Cathedral was its martyred Archbishop, Thomas Becket. It was to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket that Chaucer's pilgrims were heading, no doubt attracted by the many tales of wondrous miracles. This is the recently restored Prior's Doorway at Southwark Cathedral, and it's quite chilling to think that Thomas walked through here to preach his last sermon ever before setting off on his fateful journey to Canterbury. The donations made by thankful pilgrims became an important source of revenue for the monastic communities then running the cathedrals and abbeys, and in many cases funding expensive expansion projects. Some of these were simply to accommodate the ever-increasing number of visitors, others to attract even more. Monks were known to be sent out to search for holy relics, with the key objective of boosting pilgrim numbers. And there are even stories of relics being stolen from a cathedral or abbey in the dead of night and spirited away to be displayed in another. Consequently, the particularly popular shrines were guarded day and night. With quite a few of Britain's cathedrals, it's the grateful pilgrims who directly contributed to what we can see today. Many of the pilgrims travelling from Southwark to Canterbury would have undoubtedly stopped here in Rochester, crowding into the pubs and hostels that had sprung up to cater for the weary visitors. Pilgrimage could be good for business. The calmness of Rochester Cathedral's nave immediately envelops you as you walk in through the western entrance. There's a gentleness here, born of the soft curves of the Romanesque building style and the diffused light which invokes a sense of contemplation and quietness. Charles Dickens wrote of the effect of sunlight in the cathedral. Changes of glorious light penetrate into the cathedral, subdue its earthly odour, and preach the resurrection and the life. Dickens expressed a wish to be buried in Rochester Cathedral. In fact, a grave was dug for him in the nave, but before the body could be interred, it was whisked away to its final resting place in Westminster Abbey. His wishes were overruled by the powers that be, who said that it was inconceivable that he should be buried anywhere but the church where so many great men and women lay, Westminster Abbey. At Dickens' request and insistence, his tomb should carry no words on it but Charles Dickens. Rochester's Cathedral Church was initiated by St. Justus, who was consecrated as its first bishop by St. Augustine. Work on the original building commenced in 604, which makes it England's second oldest cathedral. It also boasts the sole surviving Norman-era Romanesque-style cathedral frontage, which would have originally been painted in bright colours. It would have had quite an impact on the approaching visitor. Today, it is dominated by the large window that was installed in the 14th century. Located right alongside the strategically important Rochester Castle on the eastern bank of the River Medway, the cathedral was inevitably drawn into any conflict. But it also had another problem. It lacked a major drawcard to attract the transiting pilgrims.
Until the Reformation, there were two important shrines at the east end of the cathedral, two very important figures in the development of Christianity in this country. The first was St. Paulinus. He was the first Bishop of York, and after he'd finished at York, he was promoted to be Bishop of Rochester, and he died here in AD 644. The other figure was a really key figure that very few people have ever heard of, and that was Bishop Ithamar. Ithamar is important because we say he was the first English bishop. Now, there wasn't in England in the 7th century, but he was the first bishop to be selected from amongst the local Saxon population. He wasn't a Celtic missionary, he wasn't one of the Roman monks who came across as part of Augustine's mission. So Ithamar was a local boy, the first Saxon bishop. And he died in, we think, around about the year AD 655, and he was Paulinus' successor. Now, neither of those shrines exist. There's no evidence of them, physical evidence of them now. They were both destroyed at the Reformation. We've seen here in Rochester a huge increase in interest in pilgrimage in recent years. People come into this cathedral for all sorts of reasons. They come as worshippers, they come as pilgrims, they come as visitors and tourists. And I think that says something about modern spirituality and the way that people engage with spiritual themes. And pilgrimage is absolutely at the heart of that. People want to have that experience where they are travelling. They're travelling with God, they're travelling with other people, and they're travelling so that they can reflect and give themselves some space as they go on a journey that other people have travelled before them.
This all changed in 1201, when a pilgrim, on his way to Becket's shrine at Canterbury, was murdered by his servant. The local woman who found his body had claimed to be cured of madness as a result, and other miracles reportedly followed. Rochester's monks wasted no time creating a shrine where more miracles were reported, so the murdered pilgrim, William of Perth, was pronounced a saint in 1256.
The pilgrim steps behind us are used by pilgrims to this day, as they have been for centuries before now.
These well-worn pilgrim steps, which once led to the shrine, attest to William of Perth's popularity with medieval pilgrims, and their thanks offerings paid for a new east wing. Rochester was never especially wealthy, so it escaped the vandalism of the English Reformation. Beyond its importance in the Anglican Church and its remarkable place in English history, Canterbury Cathedral still fulfills the role it was originally built for: the glorification of God with stone, wood, and glass, reveling in the sheer vastness of its richly decorated interior is guaranteed to lift the spirits. There's a sense of great activity here, but it also has its small, still places where it's possible to retreat for a more mindful and intimate experience. The crypt and its small chapels are one such refuge. At the very spot where Thomas Becket met his violent end is a simple but powerful memorial that speaks eloquently of the ultimate sacrifice so many have made for their convictions. Archbishop Becket was murdered on the 29th of December in 1170, inside the cathedral during a service of Vespers. He was by all accounts a stormy character, but articulate and intelligent, and his first career in the law brought him into close contact with King Henry II. The two became more than friends. They were like brothers, which helps explain what happened leading to his death. After he switched to an ecclesiastical career, Thomas was fast-tracked through the church hierarchy, progressing from priest to bishop and on to archbishop in under 24 hours. At just 43, he was the archbishop of the most important church in the country. But it then all started going downhill pretty well just as rapidly. He fell out with Henry II over a conflict between court law and church law, and the dispute turned nasty. In 1164, Becket was forced into exile in France, where he stayed for 6 years. When Thomas returned to England, he was welcomed as a hero, and cheering crowds lined his route to Canterbury. He began preaching against the crown and even excommunicated the bishops that were supporting the king. Back in Normandy, a furious Henry famously declared, "Who will rid me of this low-born cleric?" 4 of his knights took up the challenge and slipped across the English Channel intent on murder, arriving at Canterbury on the 29th of December in 1170. After an initial confrontation at the cathedral's entrance, Thomas was convinced by his monks to retreat inside, but he insisted that the doors be left unlocked. The evening prayer service of Vespers was underway. It would have been a serene scene until the 4 knights suddenly burst in and demanded that Thomas face them. Seemingly unafraid, he remained defiant, even hurling an insult at one of his assailants, saying, "You pimp." Swords were drawn, and Thomas fell to the ground, bleeding. He shouted out, "For the name of Jesus and the defense of this church, I am willing to die." The death blow was so forceful, it took the crown clean off Thomas's head and broke off the tip of the sword as it hit the ground. Today, this site is marked in the cathedral's northwest transept with a dramatic modern sculpture called, appropriately, the Altar of the Sword's Point. The 4 murderous knights were excommunicated and exiled to the Holy Land, while a remorseful Henry submitted to a flogging from Becket's monks. Various scenes from Thomas's life, and some of the earliest miracles attributed to him, are depicted in remarkably vivid stained glass windows in the Trinity Chapel, which was originally built in the early 13th century to house his shrine and, of course, the many thousands of visitors it was already attracting from as far afield as Iceland and Spain.
Canterbury was a particularly special place before the Reformation because of Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket was made a saint sooner than any other medieval person following his death, other than Francis of Assisi. And there was a huge devotion to Thomas Becket right across Europe from very soon after his death. So Canterbury was a really important place of pilgrimage.
The undulating steps to the Trinity Chapel and its uneven floor, a testimony to many centuries of shuffling pilgrim feet and knees, as many would have approached this most revered of shrines on their knees. Thomas Becket was also fast-tracked to sainthood, supported by the growing number of tales of the healing miracles associated with his relics. Within a year, Pope Alexander III was satisfied of their veracity, and Thomas was duly canonized in 1173, turning Canterbury Cathedral into one of the great centers of pilgrimage for close to the next 400 years. Not only did the monastic community thrive, but so did the city of Canterbury itself, and the communities along the major pilgrim routes which sprang up from London and Winchester. It's worth remembering that the great church at Canterbury was already a very important place in the Christian world, well before the martyrdom of Thomas Becket. Indeed, it represented the very start of Christianity's establishment in England, founded in 597 by one of the first missionaries sent by Rome, St. Augustine. This momentous occasion was the baptizing of King Ethelbert of Kent, the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity. And just 5 years later, the first cathedral on this site was dedicated by St. Augustine. There may well have been an existing building here, as there had been Christians in the area since Roman times. But now the new faith had a centralized base in Britain, from where it could grow and also consolidate. Like all Britain's cathedrals, Canterbury would be shaped and reshaped by major events in English history, from the Norman conquest through to Henry VIII's Reformation and the Civil Wars. And there are elements of these periods in history to be seen all around this cathedral. The late 14th century nave, with its soaring columns and rib-vaulted ceiling, and the many windows with their medieval glass, either original or restored. These windows were designed to do a lot more than just let in light. They were used to tell stories at a time when a great many people would have been illiterate. And books were still vastly expensive, handcrafted one-offs. Canterbury's stunning Bible windows served as the picture books of the day. Today, Canterbury is considered one of the finest examples of the Gothic style, which went through a number of distinct phases from the late 12th century to the early 16th. As the leading church in England, Canterbury was often chosen as the final resting place for royalty, the nobility, and of course the clergy. The numerous monuments and memorials also tell the stories of the times. Most notable are the royal tombs of Edward the Black Prince, depicted in gilded copper armor, and King Henry IV, whose lifelike effigy lies alongside that of his wife, Joan of Navarre. Nothing remains today of either St. Thomas Becket or his shrine, which was torn down during the English Reformation. All its valuables and precious stones apparently filling 21 ox carts. In contrast, the shrine's original site in the Trinity Chapel is now marked by a single burning candle. Undoubtedly, one of the cathedral's hidden treasures is the St. Gabriel's Chapel, the best preserved of the crypt's chapels. In 1950, a remarkable discovery was made when a wall was demolished to reveal a stunning set of murals which have been dated to around 1130. They'd been hidden away since the end of the 12th century, and so were in superb condition. Just imagine what the whole crypt would have looked like, decorated with brightly coloured paintings like these, as it would have been before the Reformation. On the chapel's north wall can be seen the angel Gabriel announcing the birth of John the Baptist to his father Zacharias, who at 80 can be forgiven for looking a bit stunned. Perhaps one of the most important objects in the cathedral is one that you might just miss. This is St. Augustine's chair, and it's the Archbishop's throne, or the cathedra, from which we get the word cathedral. This marble throne is very much younger than St. Augustine, probably early 13th century in origins, but it's named after Canterbury's first archbishop, and on it, the spiritual leader of the Church of England is still enthroned to this day. Winchester's Gothic Cathedral immediately impresses with its vast size, emphasized by its open setting, which in former time was home to two large Saxon minsters and a monastic graveyard. As you approach through the cathedral's close and green, there's time to consider this building's place in both the past and the present. Inside, it really is simply breathtaking. The long nave, awe-inspiring as it is today, was even longer when first built. In summer evenings, the huge west window floods the space with light and creates a mood of hope and optimism. The pilgrims, who travelled from Winchester to Canterbury, around 150 miles to the east of here, followed an old Roman road which itself traced an ancient route. This had likely been in use since the Stone Age. While some of the old route has disappeared under modern roads, it's still possible to make the journey on foot using a mixture of newer walking tracks and the original pilgrimage trails. As Becket mania took hold, it's estimated 100,000 pilgrims were making the journey to Canterbury every year. Their needs catered for by chapels, hostels and inns, which were soon established at strategic points. From Winchester to Farnham in Surrey, the route is now called St. Swithin's Way, after the 9th century bishop of Winchester. St. Swithin's relics were first buried in Old Minster, the Saxon cathedral to the north of where the new Norman cathedral was built. As soon as they were removed from their old resting place and set in a place of honour at the east end of the new building, the monks began their services. That first day of its consecration was in 1093, and for the next 450 years, until the Reformation, Swithin's bones remained there. In Saxon times, Winchester had been an important centre for pilgrimage, and the medieval bishops attempted to build upon this reputation by funding large building projects around his shrine. Winchester's nave was, at one stage, the longest north of the Alps. And this was no accident, as its length gave the church international prestige. Originally, it was built in the Romanesque style with 3 levels, but by the early 15th century, it had been remodeled in the Gothic style, with 2 levels and soaring arches reaching up to the heavens. The pilgrim was simply compelled to look upwards. The word nave comes from navis, which is the Latin word for ship, and cathedrals were considered the vessels in which the faithful could safely journey to God.
It symbolises to me and to many that sense of being in a place of safety, place of refuge, in the ship.
Traditionally, the nave was mostly used for monastic processions, so there would have been no pews or chairs, allowing for completely uninterrupted views. St. Swithin's Memorial is now a modern interpretation of the final shrine destroyed in the 16th century. But the Holy Hole, a narrow tunnel through which pilgrims once had to crawl through to get closer to the original altar shrine, dates from around 1150 and still bears the blackening from the tapers needed to light the way. Winchester Cathedral is also the burial place of Jane Austen. Its Fisherman's Chapel is dedicated to another famous author, Isaac Walton, who wrote The Complete Angler, the first practical guide for the hobbyist, which also included valuable lessons on life. Chichester's Cathedral has survived many calamities since its original completion, and is a testimony to all those who were dedicated enough to ensure it still stands today, providing a peaceful sanctuary to all who visit. The nave is more of a welcoming space than a grand statement. Its aisles a symphony of light and shade. It's a place where you're compelled to pause and appreciate everything that went into the making of these buildings as enduring messages of faith and hope. Located in the heart of the city it serves, Chichester's early 15th century cloisters would have been a busy thoroughfare for the clergy, lay staff, and thousands of visiting pilgrims. Uniquely positioned around the cathedral's south transept, these ancient covered walkways still convey today's visitors from the outside world into the quiet calm of the church's interior. The many stone benches provide the opportunity to stop, sit, and appreciate what is quite literally the passage of history. Had you visited Chichester's Cathedral in the 14th or 15th century, you would have found it packed with pilgrims visiting the shrine of St. Richard of Chichester. In life, he was Richard of Witch and the Bishop of Chichester from 1245 to 1253. He had to wait a while to take up this appointment, though, as it was blocked by Henry III, and so for 2 years Richard was banned from the cathedral and access to any of its resources. Despite being jobless and homeless, Richard continued to administer pastoral care and live a life of great piety. Many miracles were attributed to him both while he was alive and following his death, leading to his canonization in 1262. Today, a simple marble altar stands on the spot once occupied by the shrine, which was inevitably destroyed during the English Reformation. And St. Richard continues to attract pilgrims. He's still very much a part of the cathedral, depicted in stained glass and represented by several statues, one welcoming visitors in front of the cathedral. A bone, believed to be one of Richard's, is interred beneath the altar. Chichester Cathedral was built after the Normans moved the Saxon bishopric to the city from nearby Salisbury. It was originally in the Romanesque style, but rebuilt on a number of occasions due to major fires, which expanded the building and added newer design elements. Consequently, the interior is a combination of Romanesque and early Gothic. Chichester is the last English cathedral to retain a freestanding bell tower, once a reasonably common practice to avoid the likelihood of a collapse causing significant damage to the main body of the church. As it happened, this is exactly what did happen in February 1861, when the spire collapsed into the main tower and both then came crashing down into the cathedral's crossing. Chichester is also notable for its embracing of more contemporary art and music, including a stained glass window designed by Marc Chagall and sculpture called Christ in Judgment by Philip Jackson. Salisbury's elegantly soaring spire has made the cathedral one of England's most iconic views, but it also draws the eye heavenwards and invites contemplation of the realms beyond the here and now. Mind you, the here and now inside Salisbury Cathedral is a pleasing prospect. The long nave gently illuminated by its narrow windows creating a calming atmosphere which invites meditation and contemplation. The continuously flowing modern font which stands in the centre of the nave is fascinating in itself. It's probably not so surprising that many 13th century bishops were envious of Salisbury Cathedral. For starters, its flat and open green field site allowed every angle of the building to be admired without the distracting clutter of surrounding buildings. And then it was also a clean slate build and free from any of the compromises imposed by earlier structures. The architects and builders could go all out in the quest to build a cathedral as magnificent and as glorious as the existing technologies and techniques of the time would allow. The project wasn't without its challenges, though. The greenfield site was actually a water meadow with a naturally high water table, so the foundations sit on a bed of gravel, a mere 1.2 meters in depth, meaning that the tower and its distinctive octagonal-shaped spire required internal support. The gravel bed has water running through it which, believe it or not, actually makes it stronger. Salisbury also benefited from being a quick build, at least in cathedral terms. After the foundation stone was laid in 1220, the main church was completed less than 40 years later. The ornate west frontage, along with both the cloisters and the chapter house, were all completed by 1284. The tower and spire came later, adding a massive 7,000 tons of weight to the four piers of the crossing. It was soon apparent that reinforcements would be needed to prevent the whole thing collapsing, so bracing arches were added to the transepts, along with flying buttresses, both internally and externally. Mainly as a precaution, extra supports were added in the 1450s, but most of this work is quite cleverly hidden away so as not to detract from the beauty of the interior. Most noticeable are the two distinctive scissor arches in the transepts. These are also known as strainer arches because they quite literally take the strain of the tower's weight. Salisbury's spire is braced internally with oak scaffolding, which was added in the mid-14th century and is still doing its job today. The spire, 55 meters tall, gives the cathedral a total height of 123 meters, making it the tallest in the country. The top 15 meters had to be built from the outside and can still only be inspected by climbing the exterior. Clearly a job only for somebody with a good head for heights, especially when it comes to changing the light bulbs.
When you get up there, your heart is definitely in your mouth. All of your senses are heightened. You're obviously super safe with ropes, but it is certainly an adrenaline rush.
While the cathedral suffered some damage during the English Reformation and the Civil Wars, a lot of the original 13th and 14th century decoration has survived, including the elaborately carved choir stalls. The Trinity Chapel housed the tomb of St. Osmond, who had come to England with William the Conqueror and was appointed the Bishop of Old Sarum in 1078. His remains were later brought to the new Salisbury Cathedral, and after his canonization, an elaborate shrine was erected in the middle of the Lady Chapel. His original stone coffin is on display in the chapel, still with the apertures in the sides so pilgrims could get even closer, placing their hands through. And a statue of Osmond is among the many adorning the cathedral's western frontage. Salisbury's airy cloisters are much as they were in the 13th century and the oldest surviving in England, also the largest. Although interestingly, Salisbury was never a monastic church, so these were mostly used for processions or as recreational space for the monks. The octagonal chapter house is another 13th century delight, with its fan-vaulted ceiling that spreads out from a single and alarmingly slender-looking central pillar. Salisbury Cathedral is home to the best preserved parchment copy of the 1215 Magna Carta. There are only 4 surviving original copies left in existence. The friezes around the walls depict Bible stories from Genesis and Exodus. The Reformation brought significant reform to the Church, initiated by the great German reformer Martin Luther. King Henry VIII sent his advisors to Wittenberg to gain understanding about this new movement. So when the Reformation reached England and Henry made his dramatic break with Rome, there was a fundamental change in the understanding of salvation through faith in Christ and not by works. Thus, the significance of saints, relics, ancient shrines, and their roles in these great cathedrals altered for the new Church of England. The first and lasting impression of Bath Abbey is of its exultantly light-filled interior. Indeed, much of Bath Abbey seems to be a celebration, not just of what its skilled builders were able to achieve physically, but of what it has gone on to represent spiritually for generations of worshippers and visitors. It was the healing qualities of Bath's famous hot springs that first attracted pilgrims to the city and its abbey church. The Romans established Bath as a spa town in 60 AD, and it became an important religious centre in the 7th century as Christianity began to spread throughout England. A convent was established in 675, followed by a monastery around 100 years later. Edgar, considered to be the first king of a unified England, was crowned at the original Bath Abbey in 973. The abbey we see today is a relative youngster among England's greater churches, construction beginning in the early 1500s and completed just a few short years before the dissolution of the monasteries. The distinctive Gothic perpendicular style was exploited to the full. So, for example, there's a total of 52 huge windows, which have resulted in the abbey being dubbed the Lantern of the West. The brightness accentuates the airy spaciousness of a nave, which makes full use of the perpendicular style with its strong vertical lines, pointed arches, and a spectacularly fanned vaulted ceiling. It is most definitely uplifting, and in the words of the abbey itself, this is a building where earth and heaven meet. Bath's new abbey wasn't open for very long before the dissolution forced its surrender to the crown. It was then sold off, stripped of its valuables, including all the glass, and left to rot. Fortunately, it had a supporter with some influence, Queen Elizabeth I, creating a fund in 1574 for its restoration and reinstated it as the parish church of Bath. It's estimated that perhaps as many as 4,000 bodies are buried under the cathedral's floor. Crowding the walls are hundreds of tablets commemorating the lives of people from all walks of life who couldn't afford to be interred inside the abbey. But they show how this church was, and still is, very much part of its community. The dissolution also resulted in Bath losing its co-cathedral status, and ever since, Wells Cathedral has been the seat of the Diocese of Bath and Wells, housing the Bishop's Throne, or Cathedra. Wells Cathedral delights on many levels, starting with its elaborate west frontage and continuing inside with its spellbinding interior that makes both bold statements with its architecture and quiet comments with its myriad of small details and diversions. It all comes together to create a welcoming atmosphere which encourages you to stop and quietly absorb all that's going on around you. It's a space that encourages positivity and optimism, and which creates a very tangible connection with the presence of God. The city of Wells is named after its 4 springs, or holy wells, which are fed by an underground river and were a site for pilgrimage from Roman times. Today, the springs flow into a large pond situated in the garden of the bishop's palace, and it's a serenely tranquil place that's good for the soul, if nothing else. The first church on this site dates from 705, although it's thought there may well have been an even earlier Christian chapel here, and it originally achieved cathedral status in 909. Over the next couple of hundred years, the title moved between Wells, Bath and Glastonbury, until it was decided in 1175 to build a bigger and better church at Wells. It became a cathedral once again in 1242. Nothing remains of the older building, save for its baptism font, and the new church took over 300 years to finally complete. The style encompasses all 3 main phases of Gothic church architecture: Early English, Decorated, and Perpendicular, which have been combined to create what is undoubtedly one of Britain's most beautiful cathedrals. It's an impression enhanced by its tranquil and open setting, surrounded by what is still essentially a small town in size.
This cathedral is very interesting, I think, in that it is not a great power statement. A lot of cathedrals, I think, are power statements in stone. And this cathedral is trying to do something else. I think its architecture is trying to celebrate the beauty of the love of God. It is setting out to be absolutely, exquisitely beautiful, and it succeeds.
Wells makes a lasting impression right from the start, with a breathtakingly ornate west facade comprising around 400 statues, many life-sized in 4 tiers of niches. Here are both Bible characters and people associated with the history of the cathedral. Inside, the nave is classically early Gothic and beautifully proportioned, but the eye is drawn towards the huge scissor arches at the eastern end, which were required to support the extra weight created by additions to the central tower. Although their main role is structural, they're also very dramatic visually, and have come to be symbolic too, seen to represent hands clasped in prayer. With no saint of its own, Wells would likely have acquired holy relics to attract pilgrims, and by the 1390s, with so many masses being held daily, there was a real need for more precise timekeeping. Installed in 1392, remarkably, the clock has survived all the upheavals of history, and while the original mechanism was replaced in 1837, all the faces and decorations are original. The interior face is a 24-hour clock, which also indicates the months, and shows both the phases of the moon and the position of the sun, based on the medieval belief that everything orbited around the Earth. On the quarter-hour strikes, jousting knights on horseback appear. Another colourful carved character strikes the hour bell. It's all quite dramatic. On the outside is a more conventional clock dial, and 2 knights strike the quarter-hour bells. But everything is run from the same mechanism. Another remarkable survivor from the 14th century is the Jesse window at the eastern end of the cathedral, and which dates from around 1340. It's so named because it depicts the family tree of Jesus Christ, beginning with Jesse, the father of King David. It's also called the Golden Window because of its glowing colours. The chapter house at Wells was built in 1306 and is again octagonal in shape with a single central pillar which fans into the vaulted ceiling. Around the walls are the stalls where the canons sat with their deputies, called vicars, sitting on the lower steps. From the cathedral's north transept, the chapter house is accessed via the original narrow 13th century wooden door, and then a flight of wide, curved stone steps. The well-worn treads create a rippling effect and the apt description of a sea of steps, a much sought-after location for TV and film historical locations. In the 15th century, another flight was added, leading to a newly built enclosed bridge which in turn allowed private access to the Vicar's Hall and then onto a gate into the Vicar's Close. There were originally 42 small houses in the close, provided by the cathedral for the vicars, who as the deputies to the canons mainly took on their singing roles. Today, the close is still home to the Vicars' Choral, who continue to sing services in the cathedral, a tradition which has continued since the 12th century. Within sight of Wells Cathedral is Glastonbury Tor, the tower on a hill overlooking the Somerset town that today is probably most famous for its music festival, but also for its mythical links with King Arthur and the Holy Grail, which has made it a centre for alternative thinking and beliefs. Yet for many centuries, Glastonbury was an important centre of Christian pilgrimage, becoming one of the wealthiest monasteries in Europe until its dramatic demise at the hands of Henry VIII's reformists. Originating from the 7th century and significantly expanded a number of times, Glastonbury Abbey had also grown in ecclesiastical power, sufficient to be considered a rival to Westminster. The shrines of various saints had been attracting a steady flow of pilgrims since the 10th century, but the supposed discovery of King Arthur's tomb in 1191 opened the floodgates. Then came the suggestion, surfacing sometime around the middle of the 13th century, that the original church had been founded by Joseph of Arimathea in around AD 63, and that relics from both him and also directly related to Jesus Christ were in existence. When the dubious Arimathea relics were linked to a series of miracles in 1501 and 1502, 13 in all, including 3 cases of curing the plague, the abbey's fame spread far and wide, and the visiting pilgrims included kings and queens. Although now in ruins, its size and scale and those of the other monastic buildings provide a good sense of Glastonbury Abbey's wealth and power in its heyday. The octagonal Abbot's Kitchen, with its 4 large fireplaces, is the only building to have survived largely undamaged, and it's a clear indication that the monastery's hierarchy were enjoying an opulent lifestyle. However, the last abbot, whose name was Richard Whiting, came to an unfortunate end. Resisting the abbey's seizure by the crown in September 1539, he was condemned as a traitor and then hung, drawn, and quartered on Glastonbury Tor. The ancient legends and folklore continue to draw pilgrims to Glastonbury, and a recently established route called the Glastonbury Waterway links the ancient baths of Bath, via the holy waters at Wells to the mineral springs at the foot of Glastonbury Tor. Christians today recognize that a pilgrimage, wherever it takes us, does not earn salvation. However, a pilgrimage can reflect and bring to life historical destinations and events, especially the death and resurrection of Christ in the holy city of Jerusalem. Today, modern pilgrims share different motivations. Some sojourn to enjoy the natural beauty of their settings. Others are attracted by the stunning architecture or intriguing historical tales. Many still seek a deep spiritual connection and renewal. Each year, thousands of tourists and visitors experience and appreciate the wonder these extraordinary buildings generate. At the time they were built, each was constructed for the glory of God, which is still reflected today.
In the next episode of The Pilgrim's Way to Britain's Great Cathedrals, we're leaving the south of England and heading north. And there we'll be starting our next pilgrimage in the sublime cathedral at Ely, and then heading for Peterborough, Lincoln, York, and Durham. In Durham, we'll encounter another of the saints who played such an important role in the establishment of the early Christian church in England, and who became the inspiration for centuries of pilgrimage, St. Cuthbert. I'm David Suchet. Until next time, goodbye.